So this is my Pacific Coast Surgical lecture. All right, so for next week, and it's my annual historian talk. And this one, I always start by paying tribute to my predecessor as historian. That's John Ryan, who was the historian for 10 years before me. And I gave the John Ryan lecture at Virginia Mason. And unfortunately, John and his wife Jody could not come to this year's meeting. But I always like to pay tribute because he was my mentor and friend. And so we did a Zoom lecture. I did it with him and then his close friend Mike Harrison and his wife, and then another one of our friends, Jim Peck, who is a surgeon in Oregon. They're all retired, but they couldn't come to the meeting this year, so I did a Zoom with them. So it's very nice to be able to still continue that connection. So we're going to talk about...
Is he a member of the West Coast?
Pacific Coast Surgical. He was
Pacific Coast. Huh?
He was the historian of this organization for 10 years before me.
But he's not from West Coast.
Virginia Mason is in Seattle, Washington.
Oh, sorry. So I thought it's in Virginia.
Virginia Mason is in Seattle,
okay.
Washington.
Excuse me.
Anyway, so basically, he always liked to give a talk about the location where the meeting is going to be. And so I did the same thing. And I talk about, this is a story of Hawaiian history and medicine that took place not too far from the meeting this year in the Big Island of Hawaii. And it's about the island of Molokai. And Molokai, let me see, yeah, you can see there. Maybe my mouse is not working so well. But Molokai is there between Oahu and Maui. And on a clear day from both those islands, you can see Molokai. And it's the fifth largest of the Hawaiian Islands. Measures 37 miles long and 10 miles wide. But it is one of the the least populated and developed of Hawaii's islands because of its infamous recent history. From 1866 to 1969, it served as a settlement of forced confinement and isolation for nearly 8,000 people with leprosy, the most famous leprosy community of its kind in the world. Now we're going to start with a few basics which I learned while researching this talk. I think all of us grew up freely using the term leper, referring to a person with leprosy, but also someone to label them as a pariah or an outcast, someone who's been banished or ostracized from society. But that word, leper, is now considered derogatory and offensive, and it's contributed to the stigmatization and dehumanization of people with the disease. So in 2009, the World Health Organization began recommending that you do not use the word leper, either within or outside the context of discussions of those with leprosy. So the preferred term is to call it either people with leprosy or patients with leprosy or with Hansen's disease, after Norwegian scientist Gerhard Hansen, who identified leprosy's causative organism, Mycobacterium leprae, in 1873. And similarly, referring to Molokai as a leper colony is also considered offensive for a variety of reasons, and the preferred term is to call it a settlement or a community for people with leprosy. Now, a few words about leprosy, the disease. And for this, I have to thank Dr. Gisela Schechter, infectious disease expert and spouse of past Pacific Coast President Bill Schechter. Leprosy is caused by one of two slow-growing bacteria, Mycobacterium leprae and Mycobacterium lepromatosis. And contrary to popular misconceptions, leprosy is far less contagious than almost all other infectious diseases. Greater than 95% of the human population has natural immunity. Leprosy spreads via airborne droplets, but it requires prolonged, repeated exposure to someone with the disease over the course of days, weeks, or even months. And the bacterium has an extremely long incubation period. In some patients, up to 20 years between exposure and development of the disease. Now, leprosy is hard to contract, but it can be devastating when it takes hold. And the disease can affect the skin, eyes, nasal passages, and nerves. And there are multiple forms of the disease, and its signs and symptoms can range widely from skin lesions and ophthalmic issues to more severe manifestations such as blindness, skin ulcers, peripheral nerve damage, and the disfiguring limb deformities which became the signature feature of the disease in the minds of the general public. And contrary to prevailing societal myths, the fingers, toes, and limbs of those with leprosy do not just spontaneously fall off as a result of nerve damage. These peripheral areas do become numb and then therefore become more susceptible to cuts, burns, infections, and other damage. And the nerve loss can result in muscle wasting, and in extreme cases, bone resorption and then loss of function. And leprosy is an ancient disease. The first recorded cases were from the Indian subcontinent more than 4,000 years ago, and there are references to leprosy in the Bible and other religious texts, although scientists and historians believe that many may have conflated leprosy with other similar devastating skin conditions. The disfiguring nature of leprosy and the uncertainty around how it was contracted and who was susceptible to the disease resulted in extensive moralizing and mythologizing. People with leprosy have long been ostracized by religion and society, thought to be unclean, impure, and abandoned by God. There were waves of the disease affecting human populations over the centuries, with medieval Europe being especially hard hit. Tens of thousands of leprosy hospitals existed on the European subcontinent during the Middle Ages, and the disease was believed to have spread to the Americas via transatlantic slave journeys and throughout the South Pacific via trade routes. And this brings us to Hawaii in the 1800s. The Hawaiian Islands have historically been particularly susceptible to infectious diseases over the past several centuries due to their isolated location and the numerous visiting parties who sailed in for exploration, trade, colonization, and missionary work. The native Hawaiian population suffered through waves of smallpox, measles, influenza, and cholera in the decades preceding the leprosy epidemic of the 1800s. Leprosy is thought to have arrived in Hawaii in the 1810s, brought in by either European whalers, Chinese laborers, or American sailors to the islands. And then over the subsequent decades, the disease spread throughout Hawaii, generating fear and panic and prompting governmental and societal responses. The leprosy epidemic reached a tipping point in the 1860s. The Queen's Hospital in Honolulu recorded more than 600 cases of leprosy admitted for inpatient treatment between 1860 and 1863, and more than 5,000 others treated for the disease in total. King Kamehameha V came to power in November of 1863 at the age of 32, and immediately made public health a top priority of his government. Trade volume was declining precipitously, along with numbers of visitors to the islands. These were accompanied by a concurrent continued alarming decrease in the native population due to many other diseases and factors, but leprosy was foremost in the public consciousness. Prominent businessmen and concerned citizens pressured the government to do something, anything, to stop the spread of the disease before it completely cratered the Hawaiian economy. As often occurs in the midst of public panic and uncertainty, misinformation and stigmatization abounded. Leprosy was often referred to as the Mai Pake, or the Chinese disease, even though it was far from clear that the disease had originated from China, or that Chinese immigrants, many of whom worked in low-paying service jobs, were any more susceptible or contagious than others. A letter to the Honolulu Advertiser in 1864 pleaded, quote, "Is it not a shame that no steps have been taken to arrest this scourge in its incipiency, which may prove more fatal and far more intolerable than smallpox?" In 1865, Kamehameha and his legislature passed an act to prevent the spread of leprosy. This act granted the Board of Health and other authorities unprecedented powers, stating, quote, "The Board of Health or its agents are authorized and empowered to cause to be confined all leprous patients who shall be deemed capable of spreading the disease of leprosy." Intentionally or not, this act became justification for a form of health policing. Control of the disease became not just the responsibility of doctors, nurses, and public health officials, but grew to involve the police force, private mercenaries, missionary workers, and even tax agents. Anyone suspected of possibly harboring the disease was subject to arrest and incarceration and possible banishment. Professional wranglers, known as bounty hunters, were dispatched by local health agencies and also scoured the population for tips on newly diagnosed people and their families, and they were paid well to round them up for isolation. Never mind the fact that existing methods for diagnosing leprosy were notoriously unreliable, and that understanding of how the disease was actually spread and contracted was severely limited. Just the mere suspicion of possible leprosy based upon rumors and hearsay was enough in many cases to justify quarantine, imprisonment, and family separation. Race and social class unfortunately played a significant role in who was singled out for screening and isolation. The government officials, health officers, and bounty hunters holding power over policy and practice were overwhelmingly Western and white, whereas greater than 96% of the patients chosen for exile in the years following the 1865 Act were native Hawaiians, the majority being of lower socioeconomic status. The existing locations for isolation in Honolulu and its surroundings quickly became overwhelmed. So the Hawaiian government needed a new place for quarantining those with or suspected of having leprosy, and found the ideal location on a nearby island. The Kalaupapa Peninsula covers approximately 5 square miles on the northernmost point of Molokai, and is naturally cut off from not just the rest of Molokai, but effectively from the rest of the world. The name Kalaupapa means flat plain, and this is indeed what the peninsula represents, a flat patch of land bounded by cliffs and ocean. The southern border of the peninsula is composed of the tallest freestanding sea cliffs on Earth, 2,000 feet of sheer rock faces, with only a steep 3-mile winding trail connecting Kalaupapa to the remainder of the island. The peninsula is otherwise surrounded by treacherous ocean, pounding against jagged rocks, with no easy natural spots to land and dock a boat. There are 2 villages on the island, on the peninsula. On the eastern end is Kalawao, and then over here on the western end is Kalaupapa. The first location of the leprosy settlement was in Kalawao on the eastern side, and then they moved eventually to the west side on Kalaupapa. Following the 1865 Act to prevent the spread of leprosy, the Hawaiian government purchased 800 acres of land on the Kalaupapa Peninsula for their leprosy isolation plan. The deal was brokered by Molokai resident Rudolph Meyer, who would become the first overseer of the settlement, and it cost $1,800 in total. That's now a couple nights of hotel stay on most of the Hawaiian Islands. Numerous native Hawaiian families were relocated to make room for the first diseased inhabitants to arrive. A few of the locals refused to sell and decided to take their chances with potential illness rather than give up their land. The first group of 11 leprosy patients departed Honolulu for the Kalaupapa Peninsula on December 14, 1865. They traveled on the dilapidated sailing vessel, the Warwick, which had been purchased and designated specifically for the purpose of transporting leprosy patients to Molokai. These first patients had been assured that they would receive, quote, all possible care in their new environs, but beyond that, details were minimal. What was known was that several would be separated from their family members. The departure scene at the wharf, the first of hundreds over the subsequent decades, was heartrending. Sick patients boarding the Warwick with plumeria leis around their necks, prevented from hugging or touching their loved ones by armed sheriffs. Family members left behind wailed and cried in anguish. The Warwick set off for the 58-mile voyage, but the weather did not cooperate. Midway through the journey, the schooner was beset by a fierce thunderstorm and could not safely reach the shores of Molokai. The captain made the decision to turn around. Exile for these patients would have to wait. The second attempt at getting to Kalaupapa occurred a few weeks later, on January 6, 1866. The patients and their families endured a second cruel emotional scene of separation before setting sail once again. This time, the Warwick had better weather, but they still had to navigate the challenges of getting the patients ashore. No small feat, especially for the sick and the frail. There was no docking site available on the rocky Kalaupapa coast, so the crew anchored a quarter mile from shore and launched a smaller, oar-powered whaleboat to complete the journey. This photo is from a later voyage around 1902, but illustrates how treacherous a Kalaupapa landing could be. The first group of exiles to successfully complete the journey numbered 16. 12 patients with leprosy, along with 3 family members who served as caregivers, also known as kokua, and a small boy who had stowed away as part of one of the families. They were given minimal supplies. The men were given a shovel or an axe, plus a wool blanket, and the women received just a blanket. They made their way to Kalawao, where they found some deserted cottages, a few remaining locals, and not much else. The Hawaiian government had purchased the land, ousted most of the native inhabitants, but had not done much of anything else to actually prepare the area for anyone to live on, much less a number of sick people suffering the ravages of leprosy. The food supply was a limited crop of taro and sweet potatoes. There were only a few sources of natural drinking water on the entire peninsula, more than a mile from the cottages, and no barrels or other containers to transport or store it. The harsh reality of the settlement was a far cry from what the original group of patients had expected. The settlement had been built as a place for people with leprosy to be isolated, but also cared for. The Hawaiian government had certainly accounted for the isolation piece, but failed to provide for even the most basic human needs of food, water, and shelter. Medical and nursing care were nowhere to be found. Despite the limited resources and the derelict living conditions on Kalaupapa, the Hawaiian government continued sending patients with leprosy to the peninsula throughout 1866 and beyond. The newly banished faced a multitude of challenges: growing food crops and arranging for consistent water, building housing for the ever-increasing population of patients and others being sent from Honolulu, and creating some sort of community and social structure from disorder and chaos. They did so despite also suffering from advanced leprosy with no medical attention or supplies. The first sets of patients sent to Kalaupapa were among the sickest being cared for in Honolulu. This was, in retrospect, poor planning, as most were unable to contribute to the hard work required to establish the settlement. As more and more patients arrived in the subsequent months, the limitations of the living situation worsened, with no relief in sight. Conflicts between existing patients and new arrivals abounded. Racial stigmas carried over from the society that they had just left behind. A July boatload of patients included 2 Chinese men who were quickly banished from banishment. They were not allowed to join the existing patients in their meager dwellings, and instead had to build a separate residence far from the others. Fears of the maipake, the Chinese disease, still flourished even in this community of exiles. The Chinese men were only allowed back into the developing settlement to serve as cooks for the others, and they were required to sleep and live separately once they were done cooking. It became increasingly apparent that the people banished to Kalaupapa had been severely misled. They had been sent away, separated from their families and livelihoods, not to a place of refuge and care, but one of imprisonment and exile. The first patients believed that they were being sent to Kalaupapa for isolation and treatment, with some hope of return. They were shocked, disbelieving, and righteously furious to learn that they would never be going home. The first superintendent of the settlement, Louis Lapart, had multiple armed standoffs with angry patients in 1866 as they demanded answers for being misled by the Hawaiian government and pled for basic medical care and living conditions. The tensions ran so high that Lepard wrote the Board of Health inquiring whether the most outspoken and troublesome patients could be shipped off to an even more remote location on a different island, effectively asking to further exile the exiled. The early years of isolation on Kalaupapa were undeniably horrific. Appallingly inadequate living conditions, with limited access to food, water, shelter, or basic medical and nursing care, compounded by the exiled people's gradual understanding that their government would not be taking care of them, but had instead effectively abandoned them to die. The mortality rate for Kalaupapa residents with leprosy in those first years was nearly 50%. Over the subsequent decades, the people of Kalaupapa overcame these initial seemingly insurmountable hardships and constructed not just a functioning settlement, but a robust community and society. Among the most impactful contributions to the sense of stability and structure that emerged on Kalaupapa came from the family members and caregivers of the leprosy patients, known as kokua, which means helper in the native Hawaiian language. Kokua were the unpaid laborers who performed many of the most menial but crucial tasks required for the Kalaupapa settlement to survive. These included the basic caregiving duties of tending to the sick, providing untrained but vital medical and nursing care. The historian Adria Imada dedicates an entire chapter of her book to the essential but typically overlooked chore of laundry for patients with leprosy. Changing and washing bandages for dressings and ensuring clean bedclothes and garments were of paramount importance in helping patients maintain not just hygiene and cleanliness, but also a sense of dignity and humanity. Kokua also performed much of the hard labor required in the settlement. As the Board of Health Director Nathaniel Emerson wrote in 1882, quote, "The Kokuas are an indispensable arm of service at the settlement. They climb the pali, which are cliffs, and drive down the cattle. They fetch the wood from the mountains, and they carry water from the valleys. They go into the water and cultivate and pull the taro. They do the work which only sound hands and fingers can do." The kokua were largely spouses and family members of leprosy patients. Rather than suffer family separation, they chose to accompany their loved ones in exile. This arrangement stemmed from the deep-seated Hawaiian cultural belief in ohana, or family, as the foundation of community and humanity. When one person suffers or is in need, all members of their ohana, bound by blood, marriage, proximity, or other connections, come together to help. The disruption of family units, mandated by the draconian 1860s isolation and banishment policies, directly threatened this most fundamental of sacred Hawaiian values. No wonder that one of the names for leprosy in the Hawaiian language was Mai Hukawale, or the separating sickness. The price for becoming a kokua on Kalaupapa was steep, however. In addition to being unpaid laborers who bore the brunt of the hard work of the settlement, they were subject to the same restrictions as the patients, barred from interacting with the non-leprous people of Kalaupapa, not allowed to leave the peninsula, subject to regular health checks, and of course at high risk for contracting the disease themselves. As was required of leprosy patients, many kokua had to give up their existing property and savings before leaving for Molokai, essentially renouncing their citizenship and rights as, quote, normal members of society. One of the most prominent kokua of the early years of the Kalaupapa settlement was Jonatana Napela, who accompanied his wife Kitty to Molokai in 1873 after she contracted the disease. Napela was a lawyer by training and an influential Mormon preacher, and in addition to caring for his wife as a kokua, he helped establish one of the first Mormon churches on the peninsula. Napela would work with the other religious groups in Kalaupapa to minister to the sick and others, and would serve as superintendent of the settlement before contracting and succumbing to leprosy in 1879. In addition to the invaluable contributions of the unpaid kokua, the growing settlement on Kalaupapa benefited from the help of missionary workers. The two most celebrated of these were Mother Marianne Cope and Father Damien de Vooster, who have both since beatified and are now known as Saint Marianne and Saint Damien of Molokai. Father Damien was a Catholic priest from Belgium who arrived on Kalaupapa in May of 1873. He had been part of the Honolulu Diocese, and his assignment on Molokai was intended to be temporary, with 4 other priests planned to rotate through the settlement. But Father Damien quickly made himself part of the fabric of the burgeoning community. In addition to spreading the Catholic faith and providing spiritual assistance, Damien worked hard alongside the kokua and others to improve the conditions in Kalaupapa. He changed dressings, gave medications, helped build houses and other structures, including a reservoir, and established a boys' home for young patients and orphans. He not only administered last rites for those who died from leprosy, but also helped assemble coffins and dig graves. What started as a temporary assignment stretched to 16 years. Word of Father Damien's work spread throughout the globe, and he was recognized by the Catholic Church and many other religious and service organizations for his efforts, resulting in an influx of donations and support for the settlement. Living and caring for hundreds of people with leprosy came at the ultimate cost for Father Damien, however. In 1884, he burned his foot in a scalding bath and felt no pain, and quickly realized that after 11 years in Kalaupapa, he had joined his community in contracting the disease. He received many of the treatments in vogue at the time, and continued to make his daily rounds of the settlement and participate in building and administration. Unfortunately, none of the treatments had much effect, and over time he became bedbound and severely ill. Here's a picture of him in his final days. Father Damien passed from leprosy in April 1889 at the age of 49. One of Father Damien's caregivers in his final year of life was Mother Marianne Cope. Mother Marianne was a member of the Franciscan Sisters of Syracuse, New York. She made her way to Hawaii with a group of her sisters in 1883 with the specific aim of caring for those suffering from leprosy as well as their family members. After helping establish a new hospital on Maui, as well as a home for unhoused children of leprosy victims on Oahu, Mother Marianne landed in Kalaupapa in 1888. Over the next year, she spent a great deal of time caring for Father Damien, who had been ravaged by the disease. After his death in 1889, Mother Marianne was charged with continuing his work at the home for boys and elderly men. She would soon help establish a similarly structured home for girls and women with leprosy, and she and her sisters ran this for the next several decades. Mother Marianne died on August 9, 1918, on the grounds of the women's home that she had helped build. She was 80 years old and had spent more than 3 decades in Kalaupapa. Both Marianne and Damien were eventually made saints of the Catholic Church, Marianne in 2005 and Damien in 2009. In the early decades of the settlement, the exiles of Molokai struggled to subsist and survive, dependent on planted taro and other native foods, as well as an inconsistent water supply. Some were forced to live in caves and lean-tos for extended periods. Over time, with tremendous contributions from the kokua, as well as missionary workers and their supporting religious organizations, plus increased government funding, especially after the United States annexed Hawaii in 1898, the people of Kalaupapa were able to build a functioning and at times thriving community and societal infrastructure where none had previously existed. The settlement shifted westward on the peninsula from Kalawao to Kalaupapa. Much needed outpatient and inpatient medical facilities were eventually established, although the level of staffing and care varied widely over time. The Home for Boys, started by Father Damien and called the Baldwin Home, and the corresponding Home for Girls, started by Mother Mary Ann and called the Bishop Home, both grew and became cornerstones of daily life for young people on the peninsula. In total, some 200 buildings were erected, including homes and residential structures, a post office and gas station, multiple stores, a police station and jail, a social hall which hosted dances and shows, and several churches. Food and other supplies were shipped from Honolulu, first on sampan boats, which often had a difficult time getting close to shore due to the heavy waves. These were replaced by a larger barge, which had greater capacity and better ability to navigate the unpredictable ocean. Unfortunately, the barge only came 3 times a year, June, July, and September. The arrival of each barge bringing new supplies was widely anticipated and celebrated by locals as a holiday called Barge Day. But the 8-month wait between the September and June shipments could feel like a lifetime. Daily life in Kalaupapa was never not clouded by the specter of disease, but it eventually became stable, routine, and at many times joyful, forged by the resilience and desire for normalcy and human connection of the settlement's residents. At its peak, around 1890, the population of Kalaupapa numbered nearly 1,200 people. The leprosy settlement gained national and international attention from a variety of sources and became both celebrated and infamous. The community hosted a number of visitors over the decades, including some renowned writers and celebrities. In May of 1889, just a few short weeks after the death of Father Damien, the writer Robert Louis Stevenson, author of Treasure Island and other classic adventure books, landed on Kalaupapa for a week-long visit. Stevenson had been touring the rest of Hawaii and sending dispatches from his travels to magazines. He had heard many tales of the settlement on Molokai and wished to see it firsthand. Stevenson was suffering the ill consequences of tuberculosis himself, and part of the reason for his Hawaii trip was to find a climate better suited for his respiratory status that would allow him to live and work while minimizing his debilitating cough. While in Kalaupapa, Stevenson visited the hospital wards. He admitted in a letter home that he had been fearful of the, quote, deformity and living decay that he would be seeing in the patients, but his apprehension quickly melted into sympathy and curiosity. He was deeply moved by the level of care and compassion being administered and the courage and positivity of the patients that he encountered. Stevenson's stay in Molokai included daily visits with Mother Mary Ann and the residents of the Bishop Home for Girls and Women. He played croquet with the girls every day of his stay and was so inspired by Mother Mary Ann that he wrote a poem in her honor and later sent a piano to the Bishop Home so that the girls would always have music to play and listen to. Upon his departure from Kalaupapa, he wrote in his journal, quote, I have seen sights that cannot be told and heard stories that cannot be repeated, yet I never admired my poor race so much, nor, strange as it may seem, loved life more than in the settlement. Robert Louis Stevenson was not the only famous writer to visit Molokai's leprosy community. In July of 1907, Jack London and his wife Charmaine stayed for 5 days in Kalaupapa. London, author of beloved novels such as White Fang and The Call of the Wild, had been invited by the administrators of the board, who hoped that he would provide some positive press for the settlement. Despite many changes and improvements that had been made over the past several decades, the reputation of the settlement in the general public was, quote, as a place of confinement, abandoned hope, a chamber of horrors. Despite the extremely compressed time frame of a few days, London and his wife observed the entire spectrum of life for the residents of Kalaupapa. They toured many newly constructed buildings, including the local gun club, where shooting enthusiast Jack was able to fire off a few rounds. They were serenaded by the girls' chorus at the Bishop Home, accompanied by the plinking of Robert Louis Stevenson's donated piano, and spent time in the infirmary watching local surgeon William Goodhue debride ulcers in necrotic tissue and bone from 3 patients suffering from advanced leprosy. The London's visit was capped off by a July 4th celebration, complete with pie-eating contest, horse and bicycle races, and a pole vaulting competition. 6 months after his visit, London published an article entitled "The Lepers of Molokai" in the Women's Home Companion. The board's hopes for laudatory press were more than exceeded. London wrote that he had had a, quote, disgracefully good time, along with 800 of the lepers who were likewise having a good time. He referred to the settlement as a happy colony and stated unequivocally, in Molokai, people are happy. He highlighted the many activities and festivities he had observed, while glossing over the gruesome details of the infirmary and other medical and surgical care he had witnessed. Comparing his experiences in Kalaupapa with some other places that he had visited, London proclaimed, quote, if it were given to me to choose between being compelled to live in Molokai for the rest of my life, or in the East End of London, or the East Side of New York, or the stockyards of Chicago, I would select Molokai without debate. Not all was flourish and celebration in this piece, however. London did end with a call for action and funding for research aimed towards finding a cure for the disease, issuing the challenge, quote, there's the place for your money, you philanthropists. Other prominent 20th century visitors to Molokai included screen stars Shirley Temple, John Wayne, and Abbott and Costello. In 1952, the Von Trapp family singers of Sound of Music fame paid a visit to Kalaupapa as part of their Hawaiian tour. Visiting celebrities would typically arrive, take some photos, perform for the locals, and then ship out, all on the same day, rarely making any meaningful connections with any of the community members. An unvarnished and more accurate account of daily life in Kalaupapa than that provided by Jack London or through the visits of celebrities can be found in the writings of Olivia Robello Braitha. Olivia Braitha lived on Kalaupapa from 1937 until her death in 2006, and her 1988 book, Olivia, My Life of Exile in Kalaupapa, remains one of the most heartfelt and comprehensive descriptions of what forced isolation as a person with leprosy in Kalaupapa was really like. Olivia Robello was born in 1916 on the island of Kauai. She was the child of Portuguese immigrants and led an uneventful childhood on Kauai and Oahu before getting engaged to be married at age 18. Shortly thereafter, however, she fell ill and developed some concerning skin lesions, which were biopsied by a local physician. This prompted a visit from a health official, one of the many notorious bounty hunters, who informed Olivia and her family that she had leprosy and would need to be isolated. Still just a teenager, she was separated from her family and never saw her fiancé again. She was initially quarantined at Kalihi Hospital in Honolulu before being sent to Kalaupapa in June of 1937. Olivia's book contains harrowing accounts of dehumanizing naked examinations by groups of male doctors and a series of failed treatments, including Epsom salt and baking soda purgatives, as well as repeated contrast baths. On the day Olivia was shipped to Kalaupapa, her mother was able to visit her and share a tearful hug through a fence. As Olivia wrote about the journey over, quote, I did not sit down the whole way, but kept watching the island of Oahu getting farther and farther away and finally disappearing altogether. We slowly passed the low hills of Molokai and then her majestic cliffs. They looked so high. Olivia was placed in the Bishop Home, established by Mother Marianne decades prior. After an understandably difficult period of adjustment, she adapted to settlement life, working as a server, dishwasher, and cook at the Bishop Home, and also as an orderly and ward dressing nurse in the Kalaupapa Hospital. Social events offered respite from the drudgeries of daily life. In her book, Olivia recounts twice-weekly movie nights and monthly dances. At the movies, the kokua and other staff who were not afflicted by leprosy were separated from patients by a low wall, which allowed both sections to see the screen. At dances, the dance floor was divided between the sick and the non-sick. A row of potted plants down the middle served as a protective barrier. Despite her isolation from family and her previous life on Oahu, Olivia was able to find love amidst the leprosy community on Kalaupapa. She married 3 times, with her first marriage ending in divorce, her second with the death of her husband from kidney problems, and her final marriage to chicken farmer John Braitha, lasting nearly 30 years until John's death in 1973. While she loved children, Olivia never became a mother due to the stringent local policies at the time which prohibited reproduction and mandated the permanent separation of any child born on the settlement from their family. Olivia Braitha witnessed significant developments in the treatment of leprosy during her years spent in Kalaupapa. Working at the Carville Hospital in Louisiana in the 1940s, Dr. Guy Vacher introduced sulfone therapy, generically named Promin, for the treatment of the disease. Promin found its way to Kalaupapa by 1946, and Olivia and her husband John were early beneficiaries. Olivia had suffered for years from chronic leg ulcers, requiring painful daily dressing changes. After initiating Promin therapy, quote, "Within 6 months, my ulcers were healed, and they didn't return." Sulfone therapy was effective in both treating leprosy and preventing its transmission, and was soon widely utilized for the settlement's patients. Many, including Olivia, were able to prove that their disease had been eradicated and were given permission to leave Kalaupapa. Olivia received her first temporary release in 1948 and was able to visit her family in Honolulu for the first time in more than a decade. Very quickly, however, she realized that her life was now in Kalaupapa with her husband on the chicken farm. Quote, "The first evening during dinner, I missed Johnny back at Kalaupapa so much that I started to cry. I was so homesick. Imagine that. I'd come back to Honolulu and found out that after all, my home was in Kalaupapa, where Johnny was." Olivia Braither was not alone in her conflicted feelings of displacement and dissociation between her life before and after exile in Kalaupapa. After 103 years, Hawaii finally abolished the laws requiring forced banishment of leprosy patients to Molokai in 1969. 2 decades of sulfone therapy had resulted in effective control of the disease, and the century of mandatory isolation and effective imprisonment of leprosy patients had come to an end. Even when given the choice to live elsewhere, many Kalaupapa residents, including Olivia Braither, considered the peninsula their home and chose to remain there even after restrictions were lifted. Olivia Braither's husband John died in 1973 from complications following an orthopedic operation, just a few months short of their 29th wedding anniversary. Olivia spent the rest of her days living in Kalaupapa, but had a productive and fascinating second half of her life that impacted the greater world beyond Molokai. After decades of isolation on the peninsula, she was finally able to travel, exploring the other Hawaiian islands, and then taking a packed trip through California in 1984, which she recounts in great detail in her autobiography. Her itinerary was the greatest hits of our great state: San Francisco, Napa Valley, Lake Tahoe, Yosemite, the Redwood Forests, Big Sur, and the Monterey Peninsula. Sights and experiences many of us, let's face it, take for granted, were an ongoing source of amazement and wonder for the 68-year-old Olivia. She became an activist and an impassioned advocate for people with leprosy and other conditions. She served the WHO as part of their leprosy awareness team to help educate the greater populace about the disease and its treatment, and spoke in front of the Hawaii legislature to garner support for improved understanding and practices around end-of-life care. When the AIDS epidemic struck in the 1980s, Olivia couldn't help but note many parallels to her own experiences as a societal outcast with leprosy: mass hysteria, calls for quarantine and isolation, and widespread stigmatization and spreading of myths. She spoke out about the need for humane treatment of people with AIDS and rational discourse and action for dealing with the epidemic. In her words, quote, "Please don't panic. Please don't do to people with AIDS what you did to us. Fear is okay, but don't let fear change us into babbling idiots." She befriended a 32-year-old Honolulu man with AIDS named Tim Baker, and the two of them met often to discuss their personal experiences dealing with both the physical consequences of their respective diseases, as well as the stigmas and other societal impacts that resulted. Their friendship became the subject of a moving 1994 documentary entitled Olivia and Tim, Very Much Alive. Olivia Braither's 1988 autobiography was largely inspired by her response to watching an episode of the hit TV show MASH, in which lead actor Alan Alda made disparaging remarks about people with leprosy. Olivia's book opens with a letter she wrote to Alan Alda, telling him, quote, "I hate the name leper intensely. It is not funny at all. We are human. We have feelings too, just like you." Besides recounting her life story, in her book, Olivia also dispelled many existing myths about leprosy's contagiousness, as well as its effects, and shared her perspectives and feelings on a wide variety of issues relating to how society treats those with illness. She finished with a short postscript, a letter she received in return from Alan Alda, apologizing for any hurt feelings he may have caused, and thanking her for making him just a little bit more aware. Olivia, My Life of Exile in Kalaupapa, is a funny, informative, and inspiring read. In the course of a slim volume, Olivia placed a human face on a dehumanizing disease. Olivia Robelo Brava died in 2006 in Kalaupapa at the age of 90. The National Park Service and the Hawaii State Department of Health assumed control of the Kalaupapa Peninsula in 1980. The area was renamed the Kalaupapa National Historical Park. The bill designating the space included lifetime protections for the residents who chose to remain, stating that, quote, the park's mission is to provide a well-maintained community that ensures the present patient residents of the Kalaupapa settlement may live out their lives peacefully and comfortably. Visitors were allowed by permit only and guided on carefully regulated tours. You could either hike or take a mule down and back along the winding several-mile path cut out of the cliffs connecting Kalaupapa to the rest of Molokai, or obtain special permission to fly in and out. In 2003, an organization called the Ka Oana o Kalaupapa was created by current and former residents, as well as their family and friends, dedicated to protecting the remaining patients and preserving the memories of all those who had lived and died in the settlement. I had the privilege of connecting with one of their board members, Valerie Monson, during the course of researching this talk, and I want to thank her for providing invaluable insight and information, as well as answers to my many questions over email and Zoom. For decades, Valerie has volunteered her time working for the Kalaupapa community, which has included leading frequent trips to the peninsula for family members and descendants of the Kalaupapa residents to visit former homes as well as grave sites. Things changed dramatically for the Kalaupapa community in 2020, as they did for all of us in the world beyond. The National Park Service and Hawaii Board of Health banned all non-essential visitors, effectively isolating the peninsula and its less than 10 remaining residents once again. As local park ranger Michaela Pescaya stated in 2021, quote, we've spent so much energy to help them overcome the trauma of separation and disconnect, and now we're right back where we were 50 years ago, where we can't touch them, or hug them, or hold their hands. Despite the remainder of Hawaii and the world lifting COVID restrictions in the past few years, Kalaupapa remains in a form of isolation limbo. Visitors are still not allowed, and there is no anticipated date for their return. At this time, there are 4 remaining residents who range in age from 80 to more than 100. When the peninsula will open to the outside world remains unclear. Even more uncertain is what will happen to the land when the last of the community members passes on. Passionate advocates, such as the members of Ka Ohana o Kalaupapa, will undoubtedly fight to preserve the history and memory of the Kalaupapa community and ensure that the area does not become just another faceless, overdeveloped resort. We've just lived through the COVID-19 pandemic and are still processing the after effects, both negative and positive, of our collective responses to it. It has often been said that the truest indication of a society's strength is how it treats its most vulnerable people, and recent history has taught us yet again that we have seemingly limitless capacity to, yes, help, but also, unfortunately, harm those hardest hit by pandemics and plagues. Suffering and disease bring out the worst and best of society. The leprosy outbreak in mid-1800s Hawaii engendered fear, mistrust, and an extreme, ultimately misguided government response that resulted in the forced exile of nearly 8,000 people over the course of a century. Misinformation and stigmatization abounded, and the most profoundly affected were the poorest and most marginalized people. Greater than 90% of the Kalaupapa population were native Hawaiians. But the community that emerged on the Kalaupapa Peninsula was also a testament to the resilience and boundless capacity for care and connection that resides within each of us. The exiles of Kalaupapa were banished from society, abandoned by their own government, and subjected to unspeakable cruelty on top of their debilitating disease. But from this suffering grew a new community, a new form of family, Ohana, which still endures today beneath the towering cliffs of Molokai. Thank you for your time and attention.